The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the town of Redemption Creek, a collection of sun-bleached wood and dust-caked hopes. It was 1878, and the air was thick with the scent of dry earth, horse sweat, and simmering resentment. For 2 years, the town had watched Eliza Hayes, a woman forged in sorrow, try to hold her life together. She was barely 25, but her face, once bright with youthful optimism, was now a map of quiet determination. She wore a simple dark dress, a constant reminder of her status as a widow. Eliza's ranch, a sprawling tract of land 2 miles outside of town, was her last anchor. The Hayes Ranch, a legacy built by generations, was a source of pride, and now a constant burden. She worked from dawn till dusk, her hands calloused, her spirit weary. But she held on, a silent promise to the memory of her husband, Silas Hayes. Silas had been a man of the land, a strong, gentle soul who had vanished on a cattle drive 2 years prior. His horse had returned, riderless, with a bullet hole in the saddle. The townsfolk had declared him dead, a victim of an ambush, and Eliza had accepted the cruel verdict. She had to. Her main antagonist in this daily struggle was her brother-in-law, Jasper Hayes. Jasper was a man of ambition, his eyes holding the gleam of a predator. He saw Eliza's vulnerability not as a reason for compassion, but as an opportunity. He was a familiar presence at the ranch, always under the pretense of helping, but his words dripped with thinly veiled threats. "Eliza, you can't hold on forever," he'd said just last week, leaning against the porch railing with a smirk. "This land is too big for a woman alone. Let me help you. Just sign it over to me, and I'll take care of everything." Eliza had always refused, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. "This is Silas's legacy, Jasper. I won't give up on it." Today, however, the threat felt more real than ever. A drought had scorched the land, and the well was running low. Her small herd was dwindling, and the bank loan was coming due. The weight of it all pressed down on her like a physical force. She stood by the well, looking at the cracked earth, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Just as despair began to settle in, a commotion broke out on the main road. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of a rider, a lone figure slumped in the saddle, barely clinging to life. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a grimy hat pulled low over his face. He swayed precariously, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. The horse, a weary-looking chestnut mare, staggered to a halt in front of the saloon, and the man toppled off, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. A small crowd gathered, a mix of curious onlookers and cautious townspeople. Eliza, drawn by the commotion, watched from a distance. The saloon owner, a burly man named Gus, ran out, a shotgun in hand, but seeing the man's state, he lowered the weapon. "He's hurt bad," someone in the crowd whispered. "Looks like a gunshot." Eliza, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and compassion, pushed her way through the onlookers. This was the frontier. You didn't leave a man to die in the street. As she knelt beside the fallen stranger, she saw the grimace of pain on his face. His hat had fallen off, revealing a mop of dust-caked hair. She reached out, her hand trembling, to check his pulse. As her fingers touched his neck, his eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, familiar shade of blue. A gasp escaped her lips, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She had stared into these eyes 1,000 times in her dreams. The same slight scar above the right eyebrow, the same determined set to his jaw. It was impossible. It couldn't be. "Silas," she whispered. The name a fragile, broken sound in the dusty air. The man's lips, cracked and dry, formed a word. "Eliza." He passed out before he could say another word, but the truth was already out. The widow had claimed her husband was dead, but he had just ridden into town, and everyone was starting to see the truth. The dust of Redemption Creek had just settled, but a storm of secrets, lies, and forgotten truths was about to begin. Eliza's heart, which had been a stone of grief for 2 years, now hammered against her ribs with the force of a hammer. This man, her husband, was alive, and his return would change everything. The stunned silence that followed Eliza's whisper was shattered by the clamor of the growing crowd. The name Silas Hayes spread like wildfire, a whispered incredulity among the dusty streets. Faces that had shown indifference now held a mixture of shock and suspicion. Among them, a figure stood frozen, a glass of whiskey slipping from his hand to shatter on the porch of the saloon. Jasper Hayes, his face a mask of disbelief and fear, stared at the scene unfolding before him. The man he had declared dead, the man whose land he had so carefully maneuvered to acquire, was alive. Eliza, oblivious to the drama around her, was consumed by the reality of the man in her arms. The physical resemblance was uncanny, from the calloused hands to the familiar scar. But this was not the Silas she had known. This man was gaunt, his face hollowed out by suffering. His clothes were ragged and the wound on his side bled sluggishly. She had to act. "Someone help me!" she called out, her voice cracking with urgency. A few men, still dazed, moved to her side. Together, they lifted the unconscious man onto a makeshift stretcher and carried him to the doctor's office, a small, clean-smelling building next to the general store. The town doctor, an old man named Dr. Finch, examined the wound with practiced efficiency. "Gunshot wound," he muttered. "Missed the vital organs, but he's lost a lot of blood. He's lucky to be alive." As Dr. Finch worked, Eliza sat by the bed, her hand clasped in the injured man's. She watched his every breath, every wince of pain, her mind a whirlwind of memories and questions. Where had he been? Why had he never returned? Why did he look so different? The man on the bed was not just Silas. He was a stranger with Silas's face. His silence was a wall, and she didn't know how to break through it. Word of Silas's return traveled faster than a stagecoach. By the time Eliza returned to the ranch with him in a borrowed wagon, the town was buzzing. The gossip was a cruel, relentless thing. Some whispered that he had abandoned her, others that he was a look-alike, an imposter trying to steal her land. A few, including Jasper, even suggested that Eliza had known he was alive all along, a devious plot to get the town's sympathy and secure her claim. Jasper rode up to the ranch later that evening, his face a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Eliza, are you out of your mind? You bring a stranger into the house and claim he's Silas. He's a fraud, an imposter." His voice was low, laced with a venomous anger. "It's him, Jasper," she said, her voice firm. "I know it's him." "How can you be sure?" he sneered. "People change. This man is a different person. He's a drifter, a gunfighter maybe. Look at him." Eliza turned to the man lying in her bed, a deep sense of protectiveness rising within her. He was weak, helpless, and she knew in her heart he was her Silas. His eyes, Jasper, his scar, he said my name. Jasper's eyes flickered with a cold fury. "Don't be a fool, Eliza. He's playing you. I'm telling you this is a dangerous game. The town council will want proof. I'll make sure of it." He turned and rode away, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her sick patient. For the next few days, the ranch became a fortress of care and silence. Eliza nursed the man back to health, feeding him broth, changing his bandages, and watching over him as if he were made of glass. As he slowly regained his strength, his silence remained a thick, unbreachable barrier. He would stare at her with those familiar eyes, but they were devoid of the warmth she remembered. He seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, a deep-seated sadness that went beyond the pain of his wound. He answered her questions with single words, or not at all. "Where were you, Silas?" she'd ask. He'd only shake his head. "Who shot you?" Dim, he'd close his eyes, as if the memory was too painful. She began to understand Jasper's words in a different way. This wasn't the man she had loved. This was a ghost of a man, a broken echo of her husband. Yet there was an undeniable connection between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, she sat by his bedside. He was awake, his gaze fixed on the window. She took his hand, and for the first time he didn't pull away. He looked at her, and she saw a flicker of the old Silas in his eyes, a brief, fleeting moment of recognition. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice filled with an emotion she couldn't name. He squeezed her hand, a simple human gesture that spoke volumes. The silence wasn't as heavy anymore. It was still there, but it was no longer a barrier. It was a shared space, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of his pain and her unwavering care. The truth was still hidden, but the foundation for its revelation was being laid, one touch, one glance, one shared moment at a time. The ghost had returned, and now Eliza had to find a way to make him whole again. Word of Silas Hayes's return reached the ears of Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority was as old and weathered as the town itself. Brody was a fair man, but a man of the law, and the law demanded proof. Rumors of an impostor, of a conniving widow, and of a long-lost husband returning for his land had reached a fever pitch. The town was divided, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Sheriff Brody arrived at the Hayes Ranch 2 days later, his presence a somber and official weight. He was a tall man, his face a roadmap of hard years and harder decisions. He was accompanied by a small group of town council members, all of whom looked at Silas with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. Jasper Hayes was among them, his face a mask of false concern, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. Eliza met them at the porch, her spine straight, her chin held high. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady, "what can I do for you?" "Eliza, we need to talk to your husband," Brody stated, his voice a low rumble. "The town needs to be sure. We can't have a man claiming to be someone he isn't." Eliza nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "He's still weak, Sheriff. He can't move much." "He doesn't have to," Brody said, his gaze hard. "Just needs to answer a few questions." Inside the small ranch house, Silas lay in bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He had been told about the meeting, and his expression was unreadable. He looked at the men who entered, his gaze cold and distant. Jasper stepped forward, a smug look on his face. "So you're Silas Hayes, are you?" he sneered. "Funny, you don't look like the man I knew. You've lost some weight." Silas's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Eliza, sensing the tension, stepped in front of him. "He's still recovering, Jasper. Show some respect." Sheriff Brody held up a hand, silencing the brewing argument. "Let's start with a few simple questions, son," he said, addressing Silas. "Your name is Silas Hayes. You were born in this town, correct?" Silas nodded, a slight wince of pain crossing his face. "What was your father's name?" Brody asked. Silas hesitated for a moment, and Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. Had the trauma erased his memory? "William Hayes," he said, his voice a low rasp. The council members exchanged glances. That was the correct answer. Jasper, growing impatient, interjected, "That's easy to look up. Ask him something only Silas would know." Brody's eyes narrowed, but he conceded the point. He turned to Silas. "Silas, your father, William, had a favorite horse. What was its name?" This time the silence was longer. Eliza watched as Silas's face contorted in thought. A wave of dread washed over her. Did he remember? The horse's name was a small detail, a piece of their past. Suddenly, a flicker of something passed through Silas's eyes, a memory taking hold. "Buck," he whispered. "Buck." A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Buck was indeed the name of William Hayes's favorite horse. Brody looked at Silas with a new level of interest. "What about your brother, Jasper? What was his nickname as a boy?" Silas's gaze shifted to Jasper, and a ghost of a smirk touched his lips. "He was a lanky little thing. We called him Wisp." Jasper's face turned a furious shade of red. "That's a lie!" he shouted. "We've had enough of this charade, Sheriff. This man is a fraud." But the town council members and even Sheriff Brody knew. Jasper had always hated that nickname. It was a secret known only to the two brothers. The evidence was stacking up against Jasper's claims. "I think we've seen enough for now," Brody said, his voice no longer just a rumble but a command. He looked at Eliza, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. "Eliza, we'll give him some time to recover, but a public hearing will be necessary. The town needs to be certain." He gave her a long, appraising look. "And you, young man," he said, turning to Silas, "if you are indeed Silas Hayes, you have some explaining to do. Where have you been all this time?" Silas's face was a mask of pain and anger. He said nothing. The question hung in the air, a silent accusation. The men left, leaving Eliza and Silas alone once more. The physical wound was slowly healing, but the psychological one was a chasm of unspoken secrets. Eliza's heart ached with a new kind of pain. He was her husband, but he was a stranger with a past so dark he couldn't even speak of it. She sat by his bedside, the silence in the room a heavy, suffocating weight. "Silas," she said, her voice a plea, "please, tell me what happened. I can help you." He turned his head to face her, his eyes filled with a raw, tormented emotion. "You can't," he rasped. "No one can." And with that, he turned away, plunging her back into a lonely, terrifying darkness. His return was a miracle, but it was a miracle laced with the bitter taste of a truth still hidden. The days that followed were a torturous dance of proximity and distance. Silas, now able to move around the ranch, was a man adrift in his own home. He worked with a quiet, efficient energy, mending fences, tending to the herd, his movements precise and practiced. He was a natural rancher, a man born to the land, but he was also a ghost, his silence a constant haunting presence. Eliza, watching him from the porch, felt a profound sense of loss. She had her husband back, but he was a man who seemed to carry an invisible shroud of pain. The warmth and easy humor she remembered were gone, replaced by a grim, hard-edged pragmatism. He ate his meals in silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he were always looking for something or someone. The simple act of conversation, of sharing the day's events, was impossible. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Eliza confronted him. He was sitting on the porch, his back to the house, staring into the twilight. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we need to talk." He didn't turn around. "About what, Eliza?" His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "About everything," she cried, her frustration finally bubbling over. "About where you've been, about why you disappeared, about why you never came back. The whole town thinks you're a fraud, and Jasper is going to destroy everything we have. We can't keep living like this." He turned, his face a mask of weary resignation. "It's better if you don't know," he said, his eyes a cold, hard blue. "Don't know what?" she pleaded. "Silas, I'm your wife. Whatever you've been through, we can face it together." He shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. You can't understand." The words were a brutal rejection. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, and she turned away, a sob catching in her throat. She felt a hand on her arm, and she flinched. He pulled her to him, and for the first time since his return, he held her. It was an embrace filled not with love, but with a bone-deep sadness. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I've done things you couldn't imagine. I've seen things, seen men die. I'm not the man you married. I'm a killer." The word hung in the air between them, a chilling, ugly truth. Eliza pulled away, her heart hammering with a new kind of fear. "What are you talking about, Silas?" He let go of her, his eyes filled with a raw, tormented pain. "When I left on that cattle drive, the men I was with, they were no good. They were outlaws. The day we were ambushed, they weren't ambushed at all. It was a setup. They were meeting a man to sell him stolen goods. I saw it all. I saw them kill him." His voice was a low, tormented whisper. "They forced me to help them. They told me I was one of them now. They took my money, my horse, and they left me for dead after I was shot." He looked at her, a profound shame on his face. "I wasn't a hero, Eliza. I didn't fight back. I was too scared. I rode away, and I swore to myself I would never be that man again. I became a drifter. I took jobs, but I always felt like a ghost, an empty shell. I was on my way to start over somewhere far away when I was ambushed by a group of men who knew me. They shot me and left me for dead, just like the first time. They said I had a debt to pay. I think they wanted to make sure I never came back here." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "They knew I would come here eventually. They knew I would try to find my way back home. They were a gang. And now, they know I'm still alive. They'll come looking for me. They'll come looking for me. And for you." Eliza stood frozen, the truth a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Her husband wasn't a hero. He was a survivor, a man running from a past he couldn't escape. His silence was not a rejection of her, but a shield, a desperate attempt to protect her from the darkness that followed him. The truth was not what she had expected, but it was a truth she had to accept. The man who had returned was a broken man, but he was her broken man. And now, a new kind of fight had begun, a battle against the shadows of his past, a battle for their lives and for their future. The revelation of Silas's past was a devastating blow, but it was also a strange kind of relief. The silence that had separated them was now filled with a shared understanding, a new, fragile bond. Eliza's pity and confusion were replaced by a fierce sense of protectiveness. She had her husband back, and she would not lose him again, not to Jasper's greed or to the ghosts of his past. The next morning, Eliza found Silas working in the barn, his movements still guarded, but his eyes less haunted. She walked up to him, a resolute look on her face. "They're not going to take this from us, Silas," she said, her voice low and determined. He stopped, his hand on a rusted tool. "Who?" "Jasper. The town. The men who shot you. They won't win. We'll fight them. We'll prove who you are, and we'll prove your innocence." Silas looked at her, a flicker of something she hadn't seen before in his eyes, a spark of hope. "You believe me?" he asked, the words a vulnerable whisper. "I do," she said, her voice firm. "And we'll make sure everyone else does too." Their strategy was simple. They had to get ahead of Jasper. Eliza knew he was already working to discredit Silas and manipulate the town council. They needed to find a way to prove who Silas was, beyond the simple facts of his past. The key, they decided, lay in his time away. If they could find someone who knew him as the drifter he was, someone who could attest to his identity, it would go a long way in their favor. The search for this person, however, was a monumental task. Silas had been a man of the shadows, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to make a lasting impression. He had worked as a ranch hand, a stable boy, a general laborer, his life a blur of hard work and fleeting encounters. Their search led them to the dusty records in the town office, where Eliza meticulously sifted through old land deeds, ranch hands' records, and travel logs. It was a painstaking process, but her determination was unyielding. Silas, meanwhile, focused on the ranch. He worked tirelessly, his hands a blur of motion, a physical manifestation of his newfound purpose. He fixed the fences, repaired the well, and brought in the small herd with a skill that was undeniable. The ranch was no longer a burden, it was a sanctuary, a reason to fight. Jasper, meanwhile, was not idle. He rode into town, spreading lies, whispering to anyone who would listen that Silas was a fraud, a criminal with a dark past. He even hired a man, a gruff, imposing figure with a cold glint in his eye, to hang around the saloon, watching Silas's every move. Silas, ever vigilant, noticed the man immediately. He was an unfamiliar face, a stranger who seemed to know a little too much about their business. One afternoon, as Eliza was tending to the chickens, a wagon rolled up to the ranch. It was Sheriff Brody. "Eliza," he said, his voice grave, "we need to talk. Jasper has filed a formal complaint. He's asking for a full inquiry into Silas's identity, and he's bringing in a witness who claims to have known Silas in a different capacity." Eliza's heart sank. A witness. That was something they hadn't anticipated. "Who?" she asked, her voice tight. "He won't say," Brody replied, but he says this person will prove that your husband is not who he says he is. The hearing is in 3 days. I suggest you and Silas be ready. Eliza looked from the sheriff to the house, where Silas stood in the doorway, his face a grim mask. The quiet, personal battle for their lives was about to become a very public, very dangerous fight. She knew Jasper was desperate, and a desperate man was a dangerous man, but she also knew that Silas was no longer alone. He had her, and together they would face whatever was coming. The fight was no longer just for the land or the name. It was for the truth, for their future, and for the fragile hope that had blossomed in the dust of Redemption Creek. The town hall was packed. Every man, woman, and child in Redemption Creek was present, drawn by the promise of a spectacle. The air was thick with tension, a mix of morbid curiosity and genuine concern. On one side of the room, Eliza and Silas sat together, their hands clasped, a silent bastion against the storm of whispers. Silas was dressed in a clean, simple shirt and trousers, a far cry from the ragged clothes he had arrived in. He looked like the rancher he once was, but his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much. On the other side of the room sat Jasper Hayes, a picture of false righteousness. He had a smug look on his face, as if he knew something the rest of the town didn't. Beside him stood the witness he had promised, a tall, gaunt man with a weather-beaten face and a cruel glint in his eyes. Sheriff Brody, acting as the mediator, called the meeting to order. "We're here today to determine the true identity of this man," he said, gesturing to Silas. "Jasper Hayes has presented a formal complaint, and he has a witness who will provide testimony. Jasper, you may proceed." Jasper stood, a triumphant sneer on his face. "This man," he said, pointing a finger at Silas, "is not my brother. He's a fraud, a low-down criminal, and I have the proof right here." He gestured to the witness. "This is Jedediah Pike. He's a bounty hunter. Jedediah, tell them what you know about this man." Jedediah stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, finally resting on Silas. "This man," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "is not Silas Hayes. His name is Jeremiah Vance. He's a known outlaw, a member of the Sable Vultures gang. I've been tracking him for a year, for a crime he committed in Abilene. He stole a shipment of gold and left a trail of dead bodies." A collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned to Silas, whose face remained a stoic mask. Eliza's grip on his hand tightened. "That's a lie!" she cried out. "He's making it up." Jedediah chuckled, a cold, unpleasant sound. "Is it? The man you call Silas Hayes has a scar on his right hand, a perfect match for the man I'm looking for. A scar from a knife fight he was in." Silas, with a sigh of resignation, slowly pulled off the glove he was wearing, revealing a deep, jagged scar on the back of his hand. It was an old scar, one Eliza had never seen before. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the room. The evidence was damning. Jasper smiled, a look of pure victory on his face. "There you have it, Sheriff. The truth. He's a criminal. This man is a liar, a thief, and a murderer." Sheriff Brody looked at Silas, his expression unreadable. "Silas," he said, his voice low, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Silas looked at Eliza, and she saw the raw, tormented pain in his eyes. He had a choice to make: tell the truth and risk everything, or stay silent and lose everything. He took a deep breath. "The man is right," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the silence. "My name is Silas Hayes, and I did get this scar in a knife fight, but not for a crime I committed." He turned to the crowd, his eyes now filled with a burning, righteous fury. 2 years ago, I was ambushed, not by outlaws, but by the men I was with. They were part of a gang, and I didn't know it. They tried to force me to join them. I refused. We fought, and I was shot. The scar on my hand is from that fight." He looked at Jedediah, his eyes cold and hard. "You claim I'm an outlaw. I was a rancher. I was on a cattle drive. I was a victim, And you, Jedediah, you're a fraud. Jedediah's smug expression wavered. What are you talking about? The gold shipment in Abilene, Silas said, his voice a quiet, deadly calm. I was there. I was a witness. I saw the men who stole it, and I saw the man who gave them the money for it. Silas turned his gaze from Jedediah to Jasper. His words, slow and deliberate, filled the silent room. You were there, Jasper. You were the one who bought the gold. A gasp went through the crowd. Jasper's face, once triumphant, was now a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The smugness was gone, replaced by a raw, terrified fury. He had been caught, exposed by the very man he had tried to destroy. The truth was out, not just about Silas's past, but about Jasper's own dark secret. The town of Redemption Creek had just witnessed the unveiling of a lie and the beginning of a fight for survival. The town hall erupted. The shocking accusation against Jasper Hayes, a pillar of the community, was met with a mix of disbelief and anger. Jasper, his face contorted in a mask of rage and terror, lunged at Silas, but was held back by Sheriff Brody. "He's lying!" Jasper shrieked, his voice hoarse. "He's a murderer, a criminal." Jedediah Pike, the bounty hunter, stood frozen, his face ashen. He had been so certain, so sure of the information he had. But Silas's words, so calm and full of conviction, had shaken his confidence. He looked at Jasper, a new suspicion dawning in his eyes. Sheriff Brody, a man of law and order, brought the chaos to a halt. "Silence!" he boomed. "This is not a courtroom, but it is clear that we have a lot more to investigate. Jedediah, you say you were tracking this man. Do you have any proof of his crimes?" Jedediah, shaken, looked from Jasper to Silas. "I have a warrant," he mumbled, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "It's for Jeremiah Vance, for the gold theft in Abilene." "And you've identified him as that man," Brody said, his gaze hard. "But he has just accused Jasper of being a part of that crime. Jasper, what do you have to say to that?" Jasper, cornered, his composure shattered, did the only thing a desperate man could do. He bolted. He shoved past Brody, sprinted out the door, and leaped onto his horse, galloping out of town in a cloud of dust. The town, dumbfounded, watched him go. Sheriff Brody, a seasoned lawman, knew what Jasper's flight meant. It was an admission of guilt. "Jedediah," he said, turning to the bewildered bounty hunter, "you've been played. Jasper was in on it all along. He's been using you to get rid of Silas." Jedediah, his face a mixture of shame and anger, nodded slowly. "He told me Vance had a distinctive scar. Said I'd find him here. I thought I had him." He looked at Silas, a new respect in his eyes. "You're a brave man, Silas Hayes, I'm sorry." The town, now fully behind Eliza and Silas, began to buzz with a new kind of energy. The man they had shunned, the woman they had pitied, were now the heroes of the story. The truth, ugly and painful as it was, had set them free. But the danger was far from over. Jasper, a man with nothing left to lose, was now a runaway. And he was a dangerous man, a man who would not give up his pursuit of the Hayes Ranch. Back at the ranch, a fragile peace had settled. Silas, for the first time since his return, seemed truly at home. He and Eliza stood on the porch, watching the sunset, their hands clasped. "He'll be back," Silas said, his voice low. "He won't give up. He knows this land is the only thing he has left." "We'll be ready," Eliza said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "We'll face him together." Silas turned to her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound gratitude. "I never thought I'd get to feel like this again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was a ghost. I thought I would never have a life. You gave that back to me, Eliza." She leaned her head on his shoulder, a small smile on her face. "You were never a ghost, Silas. You were just lost. Now you're home." The night air was cool and filled with the scent of dry earth and new beginnings. The physical wounds were healing, but the psychological ones were still fresh. The memory of the men who had shot him, the men he had seen killed, still haunted him. The threat of Jasper's return was a constant low hum of danger. But for the first time in 2 years, Silas Hayes was not alone. He was home with the woman he loved, and he was no longer running. He was standing his ground, and he was ready to fight. Jasper Hayes, a man who had once been a respected figure in Redemption Creek, was now a fugitive. He rode hard, the wind whipping his hair, the taste of humiliation and defeat bitter in his mouth. His mind was a whirlwind of rage. Silas had not only returned, he had exposed him. The land he had so carefully coveted, the reputation he had so carefully built, were now gone. And it was all Silas's fault. He rode to a secluded spot, a small abandoned shack deep in the canyon. He had a small cache of supplies hidden there, a desperate measure he had prepared for just such an event. But the shack wasn't empty. A man was waiting for him, a tall, imposing figure with a cold glint in his eyes. It was one of the men who had shot Silas, one of the gang members. "Jasper," the man said, his voice a low sneer. "We've been looking for you. Heard you lost everything. Heard you tried to blame it on the man who gave you the gold." Jasper's blood ran cold. "He's back," Jasper stammered. "Silas is back. He exposed me." The man laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "We know. We've been keeping an eye on him. Seems you've made a mess of things, but we're not worried about him. We're worried about our gold." Jasper's face paled. "What do you mean?" "The gold you bought," the man said, his eyes hard. "It was stolen from our boss. We were just a small part of the operation. Now the boss wants his gold back, and since you're the one who paid for it, he wants it from you." Jasper's carefully constructed world came crashing down. He wasn't just a fugitive. He was a dead man walking. He had not only lost his land and his reputation, he had been double-crossed by the very men he had worked with. The price of his secret was his life. Back at the Hayes Ranch, life had settled into a fragile normalcy. Silas and Eliza worked together, a silent symphony of movement and purpose. They fixed the fences, tended to the animals, and prepared for the coming winter. The ranch, once a place of silent grief, was now a place of quiet strength. One evening, as they sat on the porch, a rider approached. It was Sheriff Brody. He dismounted, his face grave. "Silas," he said, "I have some bad news. We found Jasper. He's dead, shot." Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Silas's face remained a mask of stoic calm, but his eyes held a hint of sadness. "Who did it?" he asked. "We don't know," Brody said, "but he was found with a sack of money and a note. The note said, 'The price of a secret.' We believe it was the Gold Gang. They came for him." Brody looked at Silas, a silent question in his eyes. Silas met his gaze, his face a silent testament to the darkness he had faced. "I knew they'd come for him," Silas said. "I knew what kind of men they were. They're ruthless. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. They'll be looking for me," he said, his voice low. "They know I'm the only one who can identify them. They'll be coming to finish the job." The brief moment of peace was shattered. The ghosts of Silas's past were no longer just a memory. They were a living, breathing threat, and they were closing in. The price of his survival was a constant state of vigilance, a constant fear. But he was not afraid. Not anymore. He had Eliza, and he had his home, and he was ready to face whatever came. The final, bloody chapter of his story was about to begin. The death of Jasper Hayes was a grim warning. The gang that had shot Silas and had now silenced Jasper was a real and present danger. They were organized, ruthless, and they knew Silas was the only living witness who could expose their operation. The quiet life Silas and Eliza had begun to build was now shadowed by the constant threat of violence. Silas, ever the pragmatist, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. He spent his days fortifying the ranch, reinforcing the doors and windows, and teaching Eliza how to use a rifle. He was no longer the haunted ghost of a man. He was a man with a purpose, a man fighting for his life and the life of the woman he loved. Eliza, for her part, met his grim determination with a fierce courage of her own. She was no longer a helpless widow. She was a partner, a fighter. She practiced shooting with a steady hand, her face a mask of resolute concentration. The love they had for each other was no longer a fragile, whispered thing. It was a hardened, unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of their shared fear. The town, now fully aware of the truth, rallied around them. Sheriff Brody, a man with a deep sense of justice, sent for reinforcements. He knew he was outmatched, and he needed help. The townspeople who had once shunned them now offered their support. They brought food, supplies, and offered to stand guard. The small, close-knit community of Redemption Creek had just realized that their fight was not just Silas's fight, but their own. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, a rider approached the ranch. It was Jedediah Pike, the bounty hunter. He dismounted, his face a grim mask. "Silas," he said, "I have a message for you. They're coming for you. They'll be here by nightfall. The gang. They've been watching you. I'm sorry. I was a fool to trust Jasper." Silas nodded, his face grim. "I know. Thank you, Jedediah. You did what you thought was right." "I can help," Jedediah said, his voice full of a new resolve. "I owe you. I'll help you fight them." Silas looked at the man who had almost been his captor, and he saw a flicker of genuine remorse and a fierce sense of honor. He saw a man who had made a mistake and was now trying to make amends. "Thank you," Silas said, "but this is my fight. You've done enough." Jedediah, however, was not to be dissuaded. "I'm not leaving," he said, his eyes filled with a hard-won determination. "I'm staying, and I'm going to help you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, the small group of defenders gathered at the Hayes Ranch. Silas, Eliza, Jedediah, and a handful of trusted townspeople stood ready. The storm was gathering. The air was thick with the scent of fear and determination. The final showdown was about to begin. Silas looked at Eliza, his eyes filled with a love so profound it hurt. He reached out and took her hand. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice a low whisper, "I'm not a ghost anymore. I'm home, and I'm not going anywhere." Eliza squeezed his hand, a small, courageous smile on her face. "Me neither," she said. The wind picked up, a low, mournful howl, and the first star appeared in the inky sky. The silence was broken by the sound of approaching horses. The gang had arrived. The final chapter of Silas Hayes's journey was about to be written, not in the shadows, but in the heart of his home, with the woman he loved by his side. The battle for his life, his honor, and his future had begun. The night air grew thick with a tense, oppressive silence, punctuated only by the distant cries of a coyote. The sounds of approaching horses grew louder, no longer a phantom menace, but a very real threat. Silas stood at the porch, a rifle in his hands, his knuckles white. Eliza was by his side, her own rifle held steady. Jedediah Pike, the bounty hunter, took his position by the barn, his face a grim mask of determination. The small band of townspeople, armed with their own mix of shotguns and courage, waited behind the corral, ready to defend their own. A man on a black horse, a grim spectre in the moonlight, rode ahead of the others. He was the leader, a man with a scarred face and a cruel, cold glint in his eyes. He stopped 100 feet from the Hayes Ranch, his gaze sweeping over the fortified house and the armed men. "Silas Hayes!" he called out, his voice a low, gravelly sneer. "We know you're in there. You should have stayed dead, boy. We've come to finish the job you started." Silas stepped forward into the pale moonlight, his face a study in grim resolve. "I'm not going anywhere," he called back. "You came to my home, and I'm not running." The gang leader laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You're a fool, Hayes. You're outnumbered. You're outgunned. This is your last stand." "This is my home," Silas said, his voice firm, "and I'll die for it." The gang leader signaled with a wave of his hand, and the outlaws spread out, encircling the ranch. They were a motley crew of hard-faced men, their eyes filled with a cruel, predatory gleam. The fight began with a volley of shots. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the sharp crack of rifles, and the thud of bullets hitting wood. Silas and Eliza, a well-oiled machine of a team, fired from their positions, their shots precise and deadly. Jedediah, with the practiced eye of a bounty hunter, picked off men with a cold, ruthless efficiency. The townspeople, their fear outweighed by their resolve, fired from their positions, their shots a chaotic but effective defense. The gang, however, was a professional force. They advanced with a brutal, relentless precision, using the cover of the darkness to their advantage. One of them, a lanky man with a cruel smirk on his face, managed to get close to the barn. He raised a torch and threw it onto the dry hay. The barn, a symbol of their hard work, went up in flames, a fiery beacon in the night. The fire, a new and terrifying enemy, added to the chaos. The heat was immense, the light a blinding, lurid glow. Silas and Eliza were forced to retreat back into the house, their faces grim. "We can't let them get in here," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "This is our last line of defense." The gang, emboldened by the fire, advanced on the house, their faces a demonic parody of triumph in the flickering light. They kicked in the door, their guns raised, ready to end the fight once and for all. But they were met with a volley of shots from within, and a new kind of ferocity. Silas, a man who had been a ghost for 2 years, was now a man on fire, a man fighting for everything he held dear. He fought with a brutal, single-minded focus, his movements a blur of action. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a survivor, a protector. Eliza, a woman who had once been a fragile widow, was now a warrior, her face set in a grim mask of determination. She fired with a steady hand, her shots true. Jedediah, the bounty hunter, proved to be an invaluable ally. He moved through the chaos with a professional grace, his shots precise, his movements silent. He was no longer just a man on a mission, he was a man fighting for a cause he now believed in. The fight raged for what felt like an eternity. Bullets flew, men fell, and the smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air. But as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in a soft, ethereal light, the silence returned. The gang leader, a bullet in his chest, lay motionless on the ground. The rest of the gang, scattered and defeated, had fled, leaving their dead behind. Silas, bruised and bleeding but alive, stood in the center of the chaos, his rifle hanging limply in his hands. He looked around at the scene of the battle, the burned-out barn, the dead bodies, the bullet-riddled house. He looked at Eliza, her face smudged with soot and sweat, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering love. "We did it," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken sound. He nodded, a weary smile on his face. "We did it." The townspeople, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion, emerged from their hiding places. They had won. They had defended their own, and they had won. But the victory had come at a heavy cost. The ranch was in ruins, and the shadows of the past still loomed large. The fight for Redemption Creek was over, but the fight for their future was just beginning. The morning after the battle was a somber, silent affair. The victorious silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of the night's events. The ranch, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now a battlefield. The barn was a smoldering ruin, a bitter monument to the violence they had endured. The bullet holes in the house were like wounds, a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Silas, his body aching, his mind numb with exhaustion, walked through the aftermath. The dead lay where they had fallen, grim reminders of the price of their freedom. The townspeople, with a quiet efficiency, began to clear the bodies, their faces grim and determined. There was a sense of shared purpose, a new kind of community forged in the fire of their shared struggle. Eliza, her face streaked with soot and tears, stood beside him, her hand in his. "It's over," she whispered, her voice filled with a fragile hope. "For now," Silas said, his voice a low, weary rumble. He knew the fight was not truly over. The gang was defeated, but the ghosts of the past were still with them. The memory of what had happened, the brutal violence, the loss, would haunt them for a long time. Sheriff Brody arrived, his face filled with a mixture of relief and regret. "You did it, Silas," he said. "You won, but now we need to talk. The gold and the gang." Silas nodded. He knew what was coming. The fight for his identity was over, but the fight for justice was just beginning. He sat down with Brody, a detailed map of the gang's operation forming in his mind. He told him everything, every detail he could remember. The faces of the men, their hideouts, the name of their leader, the location of their stash. He provided the names of the men they had killed, the names of the men they had left behind. He gave Brody everything he had, every detail he could remember. Brody listened, his face grim, his eyes filled with a new level of respect for the man who had been a ghost. He took notes, his hands steady, his mind already formulating a plan. "This is a lot of information, Silas," he said. "This could bring down the whole operation. You're a hero, son." Silas shook his head. "I'm not a hero, Sheriff. I was a coward. I ran. I let them get away with it. You came back," Brody said, his voice firm, "and you told the truth. That takes more courage than most men will ever have. You came back and you fought for what was yours. That's a hero in my book." The words, simple and honest, filled Silas with a profound sense of relief. He had been so haunted by his past, so consumed by the shame of his choices. But Brody's words, and the look of love and admiration in Eliza's eyes, made him realize that he was no longer that man. He had faced his demons, and he had won. He was a survivor, a fighter, a man who had chosen to do the right thing, no matter the cost. As the sun rose higher in the sky, a sense of quiet hope began to settle over the ranch. The townspeople, with a newfound respect for Silas and Eliza, began to help them rebuild. They cleared the wreckage of the barn. They patched the holes in the house. They brought them food and supplies. The community that had once been divided by suspicion was now united by a shared sense of victory and a deep-seated respect for the courage of the Hayes family. The ashes of victory were a reminder of the pain they had endured, but they were also a testament to their strength, their resilience, and their unbreakable bond. The fight was over, but the healing had just begun, and for the first time in 2 years, Silas and Eliza knew that they were finally, truly safe. In the weeks that followed the last stand, Redemption Creek transformed. The once dusty, weary town was now a place of renewed spirit. The people, having witnessed the heroism of Silas and Eliza, now treated them not just with respect, but with a deep, abiding gratitude. They had saved their town from a lingering threat, and in doing so had taught them all a lesson in courage and resilience. The first order of business was rebuilding the barn. The entire town pitched in, men and women working side by side, their faces grim but determined. Silas, despite his protests, was not allowed to do the heavy lifting. He was a hero, and they treated him as such. He found himself directing the work, his words carrying a new weight of authority and respect. Eliza, meanwhile, was the heart of the operation. She organized the meals, tended to the men's minor injuries, and managed the flow of supplies. She was no longer just the widow of Silas Hayes. She was a woman of strength and purpose, a true partner to her husband. Their love story, once a tragic tale of loss, was now a living testament to the power of love and forgiveness. One afternoon, as the new barn began to take shape, Sheriff Brody returned. He looked at the bustling scene with a small, knowing smile on his face. He pulled Silas and Eliza aside, his face serious. "I have some news," he said. "The information you gave me, Silas, it was more than enough. We've used it to track down the rest of the gang. They're all in jail or dead. A wave of relief washed over Silas. The physical threat was gone, but the knowledge that the ghosts of his past were finally put to rest was a profound, soul-deep comfort. "And the gold?" he asked. "Recovered," Brody said, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "And there's a reward for you, for your help in bringing them to justice. It's a sizable sum, Silas. More than enough to rebuild your ranch." Silas looked at Eliza, a deep, abiding love in his eyes. This was the fresh start they had both dreamed of, a chance to rebuild their lives, not just physically, but emotionally. "We'll use it to rebuild," he said to Brody, "and to help the town." The bounty hunter, Jedediah Pike, remained in town for a while, a silent, watchful presence. He helped with the rebuilding, his hands, once skilled in the art of killing, now skilled in the art of creation. He had found a new purpose, a new kind of redemption. He had made a mistake, and he had paid for it, not with money, but with his courage and his loyalty. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the new barn, Silas and Eliza sat on the porch, their hands clasped. The air was filled with the scent of fresh-cut wood and new beginnings. The physical wounds were healing, but the emotional ones were still fresh. The memory of Jasper's betrayal and the violence of the last stand still lingered in their minds. "He was my brother," Silas said, his voice a low, pained whisper. "I don't know why he did it." "Greed," Eliza said, her voice soft. "He was blinded by it. He didn't see the love, the legacy you had here. He only saw money." Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was finally truly at peace. The man he had been, the man who had run from his past, was gone. In his place was a new man, a man who had faced his demons, a man who had chosen to fight, and a man who had won. He was a husband, a rancher, a hero. He was Silas Hayes, and he was home. The reconciliation with his past was complete. The future, once a dark and terrifying unknown, was now a bright and hopeful horizon. The long, brutal journey had been worth it. He had lost his past, but he had found his future. He had found his home. With the reward money from the bounty, Silas and Eliza embarked on a new phase of their lives. It was a fresh start, a chance to not only rebuild the ranch, but to build a new life together. The money was a symbol of their hard-won victory, a testament to their courage and resilience. They used it to buy new supplies, hire more ranch hands, and invest in a new herd. The Hayes Ranch, once a shadow of its former self, was now a beacon of prosperity and hope. The new barn, with its sturdy wood and fresh paint, stood as a testament to the power of community and a symbol of their new beginning. The fields, once dry and barren, were now green with new life, watered by a new well that Silas had helped to dig. Silas, a man who had once been haunted by his past, was now a man of the future. He worked tirelessly, his hands a blur of motion, his spirit filled with a quiet, efficient energy. He taught the new ranch hands everything he knew, his words filled with a quiet authority and a deep-seated love for the land. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a leader, a mentor. Eliza, a woman who had once been defined by her grief, was now defined by her joy. She was no longer a quiet, solitary figure. She was a woman filled with laughter, her face a map of quiet confidence and unbridled hope. She worked alongside Silas, her hands a blur of motion, her spirit filled with a quiet, efficient energy. The love they shared, once a fragile, whispered thing, was now a loud, joyous song. The town, meanwhile, had found its own kind of peace. The ghost of Jasper Hayes was gone, and the dark secret he had held was now in the open. The townspeople, who had once been suspicious and judgmental, were now a close-knit community, their differences set aside in the face of a shared threat. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the new ranch, Silas and Eliza sat on the porch, their hands clasped. They looked at the scene before them, the new barn, the growing herd, the bustling ranch hands, and they felt a profound sense of gratitude. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, her voice a soft, loving whisper. "Everything. It's so beautiful." "It's more than I ever dreamed of," Silas said, his eyes filled with a deep, profound love for his wife. "After everything that happened, I never thought I would get to have this again. You gave this back to me, Eliza. You gave me back my life." She leaned her head on his shoulder, a small smile on her face. "You gave it to yourself, Silas," she said. "You fought for it. You chose to come back. You chose to face the truth. And in the end, that's what saved you." The journey had been long and brutal, filled with pain and loss. But in the end, it had been worth it. The man who had been a ghost had found his way home. The widow who had been haunted by her past had found her future. They were no longer two separate people, two lost souls. They were one, a single, unbreakable force, a testament to the power of love, courage, and resilience. Life on the Hayes Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Days were long and filled with hard work, but they were also filled with a quiet joy. The scars of the past, however, were not so easily erased. The bullet holes in the house, a constant reminder of the violence they had endured, remained, a conscious choice by Silas to never forget what they had overcome. The emotional scars were deeper, and they lingered. Silas, a man who had once been filled with a quiet humor, was now a man of few words. The ghost of his past still haunted him, the memory of the men he had seen killed, the brutal reality of his own near-death experience. He was a survivor, but he was also a man who had seen the worst of humanity, and it had left a deep, abiding mark on his soul. Eliza understood. She never pushed him to talk about it. She simply loved him, her presence a constant, comforting balm to his wounded spirit. She knew that healing took time, and that the scars of the past were a part of who he was. She loved him, not in spite of his scars, but because of them. They were a testament to his strength, his resilience, and his courage. One evening, as they sat on the porch, a low, mournful howl echoed in the distance. Silas flinched, his hand instinctively going to the rifle he kept by his side. Eliza, sensing his fear, took his hand in hers. "It's just a coyote, Silas," she said softly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkness. "I know," he said, his voice a low whisper, "but sometimes I can still see them, the faces of the men. I can still hear the gunshots. It's like it just happened yesterday." "I know," she said, her voice filled with a deep, abiding empathy. "I feel it too. Every time I see the bullet holes in the house, I remember. I remember how scared I was, how scared we both were." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering love. "But we're still here, Silas. We're still here. And we're not alone. We have each other. We have our home. We have our lives. And that's what matters. We can't let them take that from us. Not the memory, not the fear. We have to live. We have to be happy. For them." He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he saw a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She was right. He couldn't let his past define him. He couldn't let the fear consume him. He had to live. He had to be happy. For her. For them. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, a vow. He would not be a ghost anymore. He would not be haunted by the scars of his past. He would be a man of the present, a man of the future. He would be a husband, a rancher, a fighter. He would be Silas Hayes, and he would be home. The years passed. The Hayes Ranch, a symbol of resilience and hope, flourished. Silas and Eliza, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness, built a life that was rich with quiet joy and unwavering devotion. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up on the ranch, their laughter a constant, joyous sound. Silas, a man who had once been a ghost, was now a father, a mentor, a leader in his community. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet contentment. The scars of his past remained, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were a part of his story, a testament to his courage, his strength, and his resilience. Eliza, a woman who had once been a widow, was now a wife, a mother, a partner. She was a woman who had faced unimaginable loss and had found a way to not only survive, but to thrive. Her love for Silas was a quiet, steady flame, a constant, comforting presence in his life. The town of Redemption Creek, a place of dusty streets and sun-bleached hopes, was now a thriving community. The people, who had once been divided by suspicion, were now united by a shared sense of history and a deep, abiding respect for the family who had taught them all a lesson in courage, forgiveness, and the power of love. One evening, many years later, Silas and Eliza sat on the porch, their hands clasped, their hair streaked with silver. They watched their grandchildren play in the fields, their laughter a joyous echo in the fading light. The old bullet holes in the house were now a part of the landscape, a silent, weathered testament to a time of darkness and a time of courage. "Look at them," Eliza said, a soft, loving smile on her face. "They have no idea what we went through, no idea what we fought for." Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble. "That's how it should be. We fought so they wouldn't have to." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound love. He had been a ghost, a lost soul, a man running from his past, but she had seen him. She had seen the truth, and in seeing him, she had saved him. She had given him a home, a family, a life. She had given him everything. "I love you, Eliza," he said, the words simple and honest, a culmination of a lifetime of love and gratitude. "I love you, Silas," she said, her voice a soft, loving whisper. "And I'm so glad you came home." The sun set on the dusty town of Redemption Creek, a testament to a love story that had defied all odds. The widow had claimed her husband was dead, but he had ridden into town, and everyone had seen the truth. And in the end, that truth had set them free, giving them a future, a home, and a love that would last forever.